Look, it's my preference. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Welcome home, everybody. It's good to see you, alhamdulillah. So we are, today's an exciting day because it's only 87 degrees, which is like spring. It's like fall for us here in Dallas. But it's also exciting because we're going to be starting a new book. And this book actually is like I have a crazy story behind this book. So, you know, if you've listened to any Islamic content, you've heard the name, Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. Imam Al-Ghazali was a scholar from, roughly 1,000 years ago, right? He was born in 1058, so he was roughly 1,000 years past. And he was considered by, the Islamic intellectual tradition as being a polymath, as someone who understood many disciplines. He was a scholar of Islamic law. He was a Shafi'i scholar, but he was also just, at his level, he was a foundational legal scholar, an usuli. He was a person who deeply understood, Islam from, very, very high level. And his most famous work, he has two really famous works. One is called Al-Mustasfa, which is probably less known to the general public, but he has another book called Ihya Ulumuddin, and or referred to as the Ihya. And that book is, 9 volumes. And what he did was he wrote this book, which translates to Reviving the Religious Sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin. And he wrote this book in some ways out of, I don't want to say frustration, but he wrote it as a rectification to what he saw as being a serious spiritual problem in the Muslim Ummah. And that problem was that religion had become a practice that was cold and that was not warm and living, but it was cold, and it was something that was sort of just adopted culturally. And he would become upset with the theoretical discussion of spirituality without its applied conversations. And one of the reasons why I really, really love Imam Al-Ghazali is because I feel like when he writes 1,000 years ago, almost everything he writes is so relevant today. If you talk about, for example, religion being just sort of like an ornament, right? It's not really necessarily a deep function, a critical, necessary function of people's life, but it's just a decorative piece. It reminds me of the statement that's almost become like a principle, a maxim of the secular world, which is, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And if you said that in a gathering of people our age, you probably would get a lot of people who, maybe even in this room, identify with that notion. But Imam Al-Ghazali, his counterpoint to that was that spirituality can only be attained through religious practice. There's no way that you can understand what it means to be generous if you don't give charity. There's no way you can understand what it means to worship Allah if you don't pray. You can't understand God consciousness and self-discipline if you don't fast. And what kind of spiritual journey can a person make that would replace the Hajj, right? These 5 pillars. So Imam Al-Ghazali's argument was that you don't have to put aside the religious practice in order to find spirituality, but rather, on the contrary, you need to actually search for that spiritual state with Allah by practicing the religion. And so he has a very interesting story. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, was born actually in Khurasan, which is in modern-day Iran. And I'm going to read to you, inshallah, from this book. So let me backtrack a little bit. Imam Al-Ghazali, his texts are many. I mean, you could probably build an entire bookshelf. You could fit all of his works on there. Okay, so he's written a lot. So whenever anyone comes to me and they're like, I want to start reading Al-Ghazali's works, there's 2 things that are a little bit problematic. Number 1 is that there's a lot of them. So what do you choose first? Number 2 is that his language isn't always easy, and his style can be very tough, right? So there is a scholar, a contemporary scholar, he's living today. His name is Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway, and he actually is Palestinian. I actually met him in Masjid al-Aqsa, and he actually holds the position of the chair of the Ghazali department at the university that he taught at. Also crazy is that his son lives in Keller, which is like kind of nuts. So we're sitting in Masjid Al-Aqsa, and I'm with Sheikh Abdul Nasser. This is not last year, of course, but this is the year before. May Allah Ta'ala free them from their oppression, Ya Rab. And we're sitting together, and, you know, he's always been like a legend. Like, people who like Ghazali have known his name, but, like, you never know how you meet these people. You just know them, you know they're alive, you read about them, but if I meet them, I meet them. Let's see, you know, if it ever happens. So I'm sitting in Masjid Al-Aqsa with Sheikh Abdul Nasser, and I go, Sheikh, do you know Mustafa Abu Sway? Have you heard of him? And he goes, yeah, I have his number. And I'm like, of course you do. You know, I just start laughing. And he goes, I have him on WhatsApp. Let me message him. He messages him and he says, Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. You know, please forgive us for the bad adab, bad etiquette, but we are in Quds. We're here. And I'm here with, you know, AbdelRahman, you know, one of the staff at Qalam. And he's like, I just want to reach out. If you're here, we would love to come and meet you wherever you are. So then, you know, this is kind of like a shot in the dark. You're just sort of throwing a message out there and hoping that he responds. He responds right away, and he says, yeah, I'm here, and I'm actually in Masjid Al-Aqsa. So we look around, and we're like, you got to be kidding me, because that's where we are. So we start looking, and then we see him, and he sees us, and he's so, again, like, understated. He's just wearing, like, he could have bought his stuff at Kohl's. He's wearing like just like a button-down shirt and khaki pants. He has a baseball hat on, right? And he's just, mashallah, is, you know, very, you know, incredibly humble, incredibly, subhanallah, just very, very modest in his character. And he comes and we start talking, and, you know, he says, yeah, I go to Dallas sometimes. And we're just like blown away. We go, why would you come to Dallas? And he goes, my son lives in Keller. And that's how we met. So he, being this encyclopedia, this genius when it comes to Al-Ghazali, he wrote this book called Kunuz min Al-Ghazali, the treasures from Al-Ghazali. And he took 40 passages from the compendium of works of the Imam, and he extracted those passages and he wrote a small commentary on each passage. So what I was hoping to accomplish with this being our next book, and you can see how small it is, what I was hoping to accomplish was that, you know, nobody in this room, probably nobody in this room has been able to read and go through the extent of the work of Imam Al-Ghazali. And maybe that might not be something that we even are able to accomplish in our lifetime. However, what we can do through this book is get a flavor, right? This is like it's like a charcuterie board of sorts. We can get a flavor of what Imam Al-Ghazali's writing was like and the themes of his writing. But before we begin with his writing, let's learn a little bit more about him as a person. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, was an incredibly gifted scholar, even from a young age. He was born in Tus, and he, you know, in following with the practice of the scholars, he gained knowledge and sought knowledge from a young age, and he very quickly was able to learn everything in his locality. And then once he sought the knowledge from his locality, then he moved and he studied with Imam Al-Haramain Al-Juwayni. And then once he studied with him, then he went to and kept moving cities until he finally reached Al-Baghdad. And Baghdad, you know, for us 30 and up, Baghdad is synonymous with what? You know, if you were alive and well during the Iraq invasion, you just heard Baghdad, Baghdad. And so in our minds, Baghdad is like this, in this war-torn country, run down, this and this and this, you know, the unfortunate scene of, you know, American imperialism and colonialism. But Baghdad historically was actually the center of Muslim thought. It was like the Cambridge, right? It was better than that. It was the place in which, subhanAllah, Muslim thought and Muslim sciences and material sciences were just excelling at rates that were unheard of. Libraries of Baghdad, science, medicine, all of these things were almost catalyzed by the very environment of that city. And that's why it was attacked. And that's why it was ransacked, because anytime, and we see this now with the Zionists, right? They're attacking not just people in Gaza, but they're attacking what? The thought leaders and the teachers and the professors and the doctors, because they want to not only attack the people of Gaza, but they want to try their best to try to bury them so that they can't rebuild. But we know Allah will give them their rebuild. Ameen. Ya Rab. We know that. So in Baghdad, this is where education and enrichment and intellectualism was thriving. So Imam Ghazali goes to Baghdad, and he very quickly, right, his reputation precedes him. He's able to ascend. He's able to teach classes. Eventually, he starts to teach at what is known as like the highest level of education. It's called the Nizamiya in Baghdad. It's the state-sponsored, right, college. It's a place where this philosophy and science is being taught at a high level. And Al-Ghazali, his lectures are filled. In fact, his lectures are so filled that the teachers of other classes are attending his lectures, and they're like missing their classes. Because whenever he teaches, everyone comes to attend. And subhanAllah, this is like the dream for an academic. If you think about it, for someone who's a lecturer, a teacher, a person of knowledge, like they've reached the peak, the pinnacle. You know, they say that, you know, for every person, right, that you reach the pinnacle, and that's kind of the goal, and you're chasing it, and now you've gotten there, and it must be so great at the top, right? So Imam Ghazali is sitting here at the top, no one above him in knowledge, in terms of intellect. He's the most famous. He's a captivating orator. He's a cutting-edge thinker. He's a thought leader in almost every field that he touches. But he still, in his own words, because he writes this story, he still feels an emptiness, a void. He has a book called Munqidh min al-Dalal. It's called The Deliverance from Error. It's his autobiography. Isn't that crazy to call your autobiography that? Deliverance from error, salvation from the mistaken path. Because in this book he details and he says that while I was able to achieve the highest level of success in the dunya, for me as a teacher, he says, I felt so void from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's teaching about Islam. It's so interesting. And there's so many lessons that we take from that. But he himself, right, details. And I'm going to read to you because Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway, the contemporary scholar that we're reading from, he writes a small analysis of this. He says, Imam Al-Ghazali occupies a unique place in human history. He says, almost all of humanity today aspires to achieve what he abandoned in a moment of genuine transformation. Like everybody in the world wants to achieve the status of success that he ended up giving up. By subscribing to the path of tazkiyah, the path of spiritual reformation, in one moment he renounced the material world. He believed that he had to give up fame and money and run away from the obstacles that prevented him from achieving certainty in his knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This spiritual crisis, this is actually what they call it in the books where he talks about, this crisis of spirituality took place at the peak of his career at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad, the position that won him prestige, wealth, and the respect of princes, scholars, kings, and viziers, and that none of these people could match his status. He was more famous than anybody. Even the royalty that was supposed to be, above him wasn't actually above him. He was popularly accepted by everyone. His inward struggle was vividly described by himself in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, where he says, for nearly 6 months, I was continuously tossing and turning between the attractions of desires of this life and my impulses towards the akhirah. In that month, the matter that ceased to be one of choice became one of compulsion, meaning I decided. That was it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused my tongue to dry up so that I was prevented from speaking and lecturing. One particular day, I made an effort to give a lecture in order to answer the request of my students, but my tongue would not utter a single word, nor could I accomplish anything at all. So at some point, he basically lost his passion. Allah Ta'ala had deprived him from being able to speak. And if you're a teacher and a lecturer, that's what you need to do. You need to speak. And so he was hit with this interesting ailment, this malady that was undescribable. His health declined and the physicians gave up on him because they realized it was not a physical ailment, but rather a spiritual one. At this stage, he turned to Allah, who made it easy for his heart to turn away from his position and his wealth and his friends. Al-Ghazali left his job and disappeared. He distributed his wealth and saved a little bit for the needs of his family. He left Baghdad and specifically went to places where he was completely unknown. Can you imagine? You know, like when you see an Instagram person and their account is deleted and they're like, my life is over. I lost my followers. It's like you only had like 400. But if people actually had like a deep follower count, like they were like in the hundreds of thousands or millions, and then they get suspended or they get, you know, they have like a deep existential crisis. Who am I without Instagram? Who am I? That's the response of somebody that they value that this is my worth. Al-Ghazali himself, this wasn't imposed upon him. He actually chose this. He left because he realized that the fame and the clout and everything that he had achieved was actually an obstacle. It was not an asset. It was a liability. It was an inhibitor. It was stopping him from getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He lived incognito in Damascus, in Jerusalem. He visited Khalil, right, the city of Ibrahim alayhi salam, which is also in Palestine, Mecca and Medina. He traveled for 11 years before heading home to Baghdad. He left when he was 30, came back in his 40s. And that entire time was when he wrote. And what did he write? He wrote all of his books, primarily all of his books during that journey, the Ihya Ulumuddin being one of them. Al-Ghazali carved out a niche for himself in the world of Islamic thought. He was a scholar par excellence in the Islamic world, with hundreds of scholars attending his lectures. His scholarly works in fiqh, in theology, in philosophy, education, and spirituality continue to enrich the Islamic tradition today. He became known as Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, because of his ability to defend Islamic creed against internal and external trends. SubhanAllah. His book, Ihya Ulumuddin, was his response to the dehydration of spirituality in Islamic practice. Imam Al-Ghazali felt that just like he and his tongue had, dried up, he felt like people were practicing the religion without really feeling the impact of it. They were praying just to pray, right? They were debating topics just to debate them. But those topics weren't actually transforming. So, an example I used to give when I would teach one of his books at the classes that I would teach, is that I would say, imagine attending a gathering where everyone is talking about poverty as a social challenge, right? Like, oh man, poverty, we need to defeat poverty. We need to fix this problem. It's systemic, it's infrastructural. Imagine like we're sitting together and we're doing that. And then imagine after having like food and tea and discussing poverty and like we're trying to fix this problem, right? World poverty. Who doesn't want to fix that? But then we all go home and none of us have donated. That's what frustrated him. He would sit in these gatherings where people would pontificate and theorize and speculate about how to solve problems, but then they wouldn't do what the Quran had prescribed as the solution, right? And so he became so frustrated by this practice that he decided to commit himself to writing an encyclopedia on how to rehydrate the practice of Islam for Muslims. And he called it Ihya Ulumuddin, reviving the religious sciences, right? They've gone dormant. We pray, but we don't feel the prayer. And all of the, we read one of his books a long time ago in 30 and Up called The Secrets of Prayer. He goes through the 5 pillars and he discusses them at length spiritually. And he says, for example, if a person wants to stand and pray and they want to benefit from their prayer, he gives like a long list of advices on how to benefit from your prayer. It's incredible. He talks about perfuming your prayer rug, designing a nice prayer area in your home, right? Praying at a time when you're not compelled by urgency or need, right? Some people, when they're hungry or they, 30 and up, so we can probably speak on this pretty openly. You have to use the bathroom, but you're like, I don't want to make wudu again. Let me just pray, and then He gave all these advices. He said, you want to pray, you want to do all this, but you're doing it wrong. And because you're not giving it its spiritual right, you're not obtaining the fruit of what Salah can give you. And so he wrote this extended work, the Ihya, and his intention, may Allah accept it, was to remotivate and re-inspire the Muslims with their practice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. or connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's a lot more to say about Al-Ghazali, but I don't want to make this like a biography of his life. But all you need to know about him is that he is really one of one. He's somebody that is, there's really very few people like him. And his understanding of the Islamic tradition was so powerful that every generation of Muslim scholars, no matter what school of thought, no matter which flavor of Islam, no matter how they understood the tradition, they all accepted him. And in fact, they all claim him. They're like, no, he's one of us. Well, he's one of us. And everyone really, and that's a sign again of someone's universal acceptance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're going to go through this text, inshallah, and we're going to pick out these beautiful, it's like we're going to do a sampling. This is kind of like intellectual tapas, right? We're going to do a little sample of each of his books as picked out by the contemporary, perhaps, leader in Al-Ghazali, Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway. So the first one, and this is pretty much par for the course when it comes to how scholars think, is a quote on intention. So he writes, and this comes from his text, which is actually one of the later texts that he wrote, almost his last. It's called Ayyuha al-Walad. The background of this text, Ayyuha al-Walad, is that he has a student that had been studying with him for a long time and had been covering a lot of ground with Islamic knowledge. And at the end of his studies, 10 years, 15 years. By the way, if we translate that, I want you to understand like 10 years of studying something, 15 years, 20 years. Like undergrad is 4 years, master's program 2 to 3 years, right? PhD can be 3 years, 4 years, plus 3 more years. So, I mean, if we're talking about the scholars that study and they give 10, 15, 20 years, we're talking about people that are probably more qualified in their field than the average expert in the American academic or professional realm. Like, if someone in America has a master's, we consider them an expert, right? Unless that person works for CloudStrike and they shut down the world, right? They're definitely not an expert, right? But now, when we give that respect to the expert of, cybersecurity or the expert of, systems management or healthcare, or this and that, the person has an MBA, a master's in business administration, and they've gone to school for 6 years, which is a lot of work. But now let's do the math: 20 years of studying, 2 decades. Okay, so understand just like the quality of the person that we're talking about. So this person, at the end of his studies with his teacher, Al-Ghazali, he writes him a letter. And in the letter, he tells him, oh, Ya Imam, I've studied with you for this much time. I've spent so much time with you. And he goes, I've covered all these topics and all these texts with you, but can you please just do me one favor? He says, can you just give me the key, like what is the principal thing that I need to remember? If there's one thing out of all these years I spent with you, what is it? Give me the key to success, the nectar of knowledge. And so Imam Ghazali, in a very fitting way, writes a book, 80 pages, called Ayyuha al-Walad al-Muhib, oh my beloved son, referring to the student. And he says, he gives him a list of advices. It's like 20 advices long. And we'll read it together, inshallah, at some point. But the core of it, Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway captures in this passage. Okay? So he's talking to this student who spent a lot of time studying. And here's what he says. أيها الولد كم من ليال أحييتها بتكرار العلم ومطالعة الكتب. He says, how many nights have you stayed awake? Have you given life to the night, revising and memorizing and poring over the books of knowledge? وحرمت على نفسك النوم. And as a result of that, you've deprived yourself from sleep. Right, this is probably triggering us for our, school days. Like, you're staying up late, pulling those all-nighters, trying to memorize the charts or trying to memorize the list of dates and names and whatever you can. So he's talking to his student. And he's saying, I want you to think back and appreciate all of the sacrifice that you've made. What have you given to accomplish where you've come, where you've achieved? Like, what have you sacrificed to reach this state? So everyone now in this room, like, think about yourself. I know like time flies and we forget, but I want you to think about like, do you remember that random Tuesday in the winter in your sophomore year of college? And you like looked back and you're like, it's only the third week and I have so much school left. You did your degree audit and you're like, I have like 1 billion credits to fulfill. I want to get married. Like, what's going on? You know, like you're just trying to figure out when am I going to, and then after that, like I need to get an internship or I need to get into this program. Am I going to get a job? Do I go to grad school? And as you're going down that path, it seems like you just become accustomed to the idea of just giving up your life. And you're doing it because you believe that it's worth it. Like you think that at the end of all this, there's something that's going to make all of this feel worth it. You know, whether it's that job that I want or whether it's that career that I've been, you know, idealizing since I was a kid or whatnot, or I'll finally make my parents happy. Maybe. You know, why'd you get a B? Okay, well, حرمت على نفسك النوم. He says, لا أعلم ما كان الباعث فيه. He says, I don't know why you did all this. I don't know why you did all this. That's like a really jolting statement to say to your student. Why did you do all that? Almost like completely dismissing it. You didn't have to do all that. Why did you do all that? He says, إن كان نيل عرض الدنيا وجذب حطامها وتحصيل مناصبها والمباهاة على الأقران والأمثال. He says, if the purpose for you to do all that was to attain worldly success and for you to gather and capture all of these vain things that people think about, you know, Chanel, Hermes, and Mercedes, and Tesla, and this and that, living in that zip code. Maybe I'll make it to Plano one day, right? Like, maybe I can eventually go from Plano to Frisco, and then that many square feet, and this type of front door. He says, if this was the purpose that you did it, and then he says, وَالْمُبَاهَاةُ عَلَى الْأَقْرَانِ وَالْأَمْثَالِ, and you wanted to accomplish the acceptance and the bragging rights from your peers, people that you could look to, you know, keeping up with the Joneses. You want to actually be the Jones family. You know, I want to show off in front of my friends. He says, if this is why you did what you did, فَوَيْنٌ لَكْ ثُمَّ وَيْنٌ لَكْ. He said, then, basically, you're done. You know, as we say now, woe to you. It's like you're cooked. You're done. And you have to imagine that he's speaking to a student of Islamic knowledge. And obviously there's a certain sanctity with religion where you absolutely don't seek knowledge for those reasons. But we can also translate this, by the way, to like anything that we do that should be for Allah's sake. Like, why are you good to your family? Like, why are you a good person? Why do you try to do the right thing? Why do you hold back from certain desires? Why? Like, why do we do these things? You know, it's not wrong for a person to do the right thing and to be rewarded for it in this life, but a Muslim always has the intention that is beyond that. You know, otherwise we become transactional. We only do the right thing when we know that we're going to get rewarded for it. And then it ceases to be the right thing. It just ceases to be the right deal. Right? But when we do something for the sake of Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, we actually are not thinking about the transactional side of things. In fact, when you do a good deed, Imam Al-Ghazali says, in another book he writes, that he says that your goal, it's called Bidayat al-Hidayah. He says, when you do a good deed, your goal should be to forget that you even did the good deed. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but have you guys ever held the door open for somebody before? Do you remember that moment? No, you don't. Until I said it, you forgot it. Do you walk around all day and you're like, just held the door open for somebody? And you like text your friends, you're like, guess who held the door open for somebody? No, you do it and you forget about it. That is what sincerity feels like. It's a good deed. It was a good thing to do. And you didn't expect any reward. You didn't expect anything at all. You just did it because it was kind. It was courteous. And it was part of good character. And you didn't brag about it, nor did you talk about it. You know, you didn't write about it in your diary. Dear diary, today, I actually held the door open. You did it purely for the sake of Allah. That's what ikhlas feels like. Now imagine that you prayed Fajr and you were able to do that. Or imagine you gave charity and you did that. Or you made food for somebody and you did it. These are the goals that we should have. I want to be able to do something that's so good, but I want to just leave that between me and Allah. And I actually don't want to receive any worldly benefit for it. Some of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they were actually really concerned about receiving worldly rewards for good things that they had done. Because, and I don't want you guys to trip on this, so don't trip on this, okay? Just take it for what it is, but think about it, don't trip on it. They were concerned that if they did something good and then that person gave them like something material, like money or whatever in return, that they said, well, maybe Allah is not giving me reward in the afterlife, He's just giving it to me here. So like if I teach someone how to pray and that person bakes me a cake, the Sahabi would say, no, I don't want it here, I want it there. You know, I did it for there, not here. Is it tres leches? Yeah, I did it for there, right? It's not tres, I did it for there for sure. They didn't want to sacrifice what their intention was by accepting something prematurely. Now, again, don't get tripped up about it. Like, it's not, this was their own level of caution. So if you do something nice for somebody and somebody gives you a gift as a thank you, don't, no one hears Abu Hurairah. You don't have to be like, no, I must not, you know? It's okay to take it, but be careful not to let that moment destroy the sincerity that you had, that you felt. Okay? So then he says, وَإِنْ كَانَ قَصْدُكَ فِيهِ إِحْيَاءُ الشَّرِيعَةِ النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم وتهذيب أخلاقك وكسر النفس الأمارة بالسوء فتوبى لك ثم توبى لك. He says, but rather, if the purpose of you doing all of this was to revive the practice of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in your life, I'm doing this because it connects me to him ﷺ. That's why I'm doing this. And by the way, I'm going to pause here for a second. One of my teachers told me, really amazing. He said, notice how when the Day of Judgment is talked about in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ will recognize who you are based on how close you were to him in your life. So like, he's not going to know you based on how recognizable you were in the dunya. He won't know you based on the follower count or the social circle. He doesn't know people based on that. But we learn he will recognize his ummah based on things like the signs of wudu on their body, the signs of prayer on their body, the signs of charity, that they were charitable. Those people who dedicated their life to fasting, right? They're going to enter through a specific door on the Day of Judgment. These are all the signs by which the Prophet ﷺ will say, hey, I know you. I know you. Imagine, like, who doesn't love being recognized? You know, someone comes up to you and they're like, are you, right? And you're like, yeah. Or like, are you related to so-and-so? What's your last name? Oh, I know you. Oh, we're cousins, right? Oh, I know your uncle. I went to school with them. This is, like, that's a nice feeling, especially if you're in a place like the Day of Judgment where you don't know anybody and everyone's running away from each other. Imagine then on the Day of Judgment, the Prophet ﷺ comes to you, you just feel someone take your hand and you're like, and he looks at you, I know you. Like, you did your best. All the narrations, the only thing The only thing that will give us recognizability on that day is how much we try to replicate him and his actions. May Allah Ta'ala give us that. So he says, if this was the reason why you did it, to revive the spirit of the Prophet in your life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to hold yourself back and to correct your, I can't read, my vision's blurry, and to hold yourself back, وَتَهْذِيبُ أَخْلَاقِكَ وَكَسْرُ النَّفْسِ, to correct your character and to break the nafs al-amara bis-su that commands you towards evil, then he says, good job, you figured it out. فَتُوبَ لَكَ, you're blessed, you figured it out. So I want to read to you what Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway said about this particular passage. He says, in this passage, the Imam is responding to one of his students who spent many years seeking knowledge. His student is asking him what will be beneficial for him in the hereafter. So Imam Al-Ghazali writes this point, this passage. Now, he says, Dr. Mustafa, while it was about seeking deeper insight into spiritual knowledge, this can be applied to all human activity. So everyone here who's like thinking like, yeah, but I'm not a scholar, like I haven't studied Islam for 20 years. I'm just going to work. Like, how does this affect me? He says, this affects all human activity. What is done for the sake of Allah earns reward, and what is done for the world ends in the world. Now, the beautiful thing about Islam is that you can take any action that you're doing for anything and make it for Allah. You can cook for your family, or you can cook for the sake of Allah. You can clean. My mom, actually, when she would tell us to clean our room, she would never tell us, like, clean your room because it's dirty. She would say, clean your room because the angels won't come in. And as a kid, I was like, stop being so intense, right? But now as an adult, I appreciate her thoughtfulness in trying to elevate my intention. Right? You can try to clean something because it's what, maybe I'm a clean person, or maybe you want to help your roommates, or you can clean because it's the right thing to do, or you can elevate your intention and say, you know what? By cleaning, I'm inviting the angels into my abode, because angels don't like dirty places. And subhanAllah, who doesn't want angels protecting them? Who doesn't want the malaika surrounding their home, in their home? Who doesn't want that? I know we're all thinking about the dishes in our sink right now. So he says, what is done for the sake of Allah earns a reward here and in the next life. What is done in this world ends here at best, but also could land a person in an unfavorable position in the afterlife. Then he goes on to say this, and this is important. No matter what field or category, seeking fame and position and material wealth can be detrimental to the soul. But this is exactly what people have sought throughout history. Imam Malik, who was one of the most famous scholars in Islam, he said, I have achieved fame, which is true. He was known by everybody. And he goes, and I have found there is not a single thing good in it. I was just with somebody the other night, and this person was talking about somebody who was like well known, and they were sitting with that person. I want you to think of like Sheikh Omar Sulaiman, Mufti Menk, people who are like really well known. I always wonder, like, how does Omar Sulaiman do Umrah? Like, how does Mufti Menk do anything? Like, he's like undeniable. Look at that beard, man, mashallah. So you look at these people that are like, they are undeniably them, Some people look at me and they're like, Hagrid? Like, I'm like, no, so sometimes I say yes. I'm like, yeah. But I wonder about, these, mashallah, very well-known people. And so this brother I was with like, someone who was very recognizable. And I think somebody like paid for their dinner or something. They were at a restaurant and somebody paid for their dinner. And the brother, jokingly, my friend said to this well-known person that, oh, it must be nice, And the guy actually looked and said, actually, it's not. He goes, it's really not. Like, I can't do anything. You know, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do this. And he wasn't complaining because Allah Ta'ala places everybody in specific, but he was just saying, like, it's not all it's cracked up to be. And I recently read a quote from some celebrity who said the same thing. Like, can't go grocery shopping, can't do this, can't do that. It's almost like being in prison. It's like being under house arrest in some ways, subhanAllah. So he says, fame and position and material wealth can be detrimental to the soul, but this is what people seek. People who don't have it seek it. Islam, he writes, is not against material gain if it is lawful. And if one spends in a halal way without being stingy, they pay their zakat, and they don't spend extravagantly, then their wealth is pure. So there's nothing wrong with being wealthy inherently. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, he continues and he says, indeed, Islam can encourage wholesome income from lawful sources for the right purpose, because the good that an individual can do for the community and for the responsibility of the social need can be great. So if people do make money, they're able to accomplish great things. They're able to help purchase buildings like this. They're able to build infrastructural benefit to people in places that don't have it. I mean, wealth in and of itself is not bad, but unchecked, unrestrained can be a challenge. So he said, suffice to know, there were wealthy companions of the Prophet ﷺ, including Uthman bin Affan, who was the third Khalifa, AbdelRahman bin Auf, who was a great companion of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, but many of them, these wealthy companions, donated substantial amounts of their money or property for the sake of the good of the ummah. So, of these companions of the Prophet ﷺ, radiyallahu anhum ajma'in. He says, as for fame, if it comes as a result of a civic engagement, scientific achievement, championing humanitarian cause, or any other good deed for the welfare of society or humanity at large, without translating this fame into being pretentious, then it is a good thing, because it can be beneficial to whatever project one has embarked upon. So you have Jaylen Brown, mashallah, who's he's on the Celtics, who won the championship in the NBA. They won the NBA finals, and he's the MVP of the finals. And 48 hours after doing that, he's posting pictures on Instagram of him in Mecca and Medina because he's Muslim. He's making Umrah. And, I think after the two Eids, there's nothing Muslims love than seeing a celebrity convert to Islam. We're like, yes. See? We're like showing everybody. See? And so, again, an example, a real life example. If LeBron James converted to Islam today, like, how many people would know about Islam? So there is potential. There's always potential for good through things that are beneficial. But he says, of course, without it translating into pretentious behavior. And he says, service to all, Muslim and non, is a key to success. And Muslims should be contributing towards eliminating these challenges like illiteracy, like sanitizing fresh water sources to make sure that people have clean water to drink, and fighting disease. So he says, basically, if you are well known because of your accomplishments, there's no problem with that. If you succeed in your work, if you climb the ladder and you're able to become a VP, or you're able to be a person that is getting up there, right? That's actually a good thing, because then you are a Muslim in a high standing place. You can provide benefit to other Muslims. I actually met someone recently who's like he's the founder and the CTO of his company. And I asked him, I go, do you hire Muslims because they're Muslim? He goes, of course. And he goes, even if there's somebody who's slightly more qualified than them who's not Muslim, I hire the Muslim. And I said, why? He goes, we got to look out for our own. And he said, they do it. And I said, who? And he goes, it was not Kanye West. It was, but he said, they do it. I said, I know. So again, how many families, how many mouths of Muslim children is this guy feeding through Allah's blessing because he looks out for Muslims? So if you can accomplish that, if you can become a person who's successful in your career, in your place of work, in your professional aspiration you're able to climb, and you're able to provide benefit to the ummah and also humanity, of course. But if you're able to provide benefit to the ummah, it's not a bad thing. But all he's saying here is that don't let it get to your head. Don't let your pursuit of the material world overshadow your pursuit of the akhirah. Because, and as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You know, it might start out with, oh, I want to be successful so that I can provide this and that for the ummah. And then at the end of it, you realize, like, man, I forgot that intention a long time ago. And I lost myself. You know, don't get lost in the sauce, as they say. So he says, one should be wary of the potential negative impact of things like fame and wealth on the heart. Positions of responsibility should undoubtedly be filled. But in the case that one has to remember, one is always at the service of the public. And that relationship with the public is horizontal, not vertical. Subhanallah. One is on the same level as the people that one serves, not higher than them. There is a problem if one is not the right person for the job or does not have the necessary skills. There is a more serious problem if the ones seeking positions are egotistical, arrogant, hungry for power, and they use that as a means to gain, to inflict harm over other people. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. So this is the advice that Imam Al-Ghazali has towards his student. And ultimately it's summarized in what? Make sure that your intention is always upright. Al-Hasan al-Basri, rahimahullah, he has a very beautiful process for intention. He says that every person who does a good action or an action that they want to make their intention good should do three things. For every action, you should do three things. He says, number one, before you do the action, you should clarify your intention. So whatever action you're going to do, whether it's explicitly religious or whether it's something that's more mundane, like just, you know, getting dressed or brushing your teeth, etc., or whether it's praying, donating, you have to check your intention quickly before you do it. What am I doing this for? What am I trying to achieve from this? Okay. The second thing is, Hasan al-Basri says, in the middle of the action. So while you're doing it, as you're in the process of the action itself, you should check your intention once more. Why am I doing this? And then at the end, once you've completed the deed, once you've finished, you should remind yourself, I did this because of this. And he says that if a person is able to do these three quick steps, they take 2 seconds each time, just remind yourself of why you're doing it. He says this person will have habituated sincerity. They will have made it a behavioral norm. Every time I do something, I'm checking my sincerity. I'm checking my ikhlas. I'm making sure that I'm doing things for the right reasons, inshallah. We ask Allah Ta'ala to accept from us. We ask Allah Ta'ala to make us sincere and to make us those that are able to practice sincerity regularly. We ask Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to allow us to be those who never ever have to face the challenge of arrogance or of insincerity or hypocrisy. We ask Allah Ta'ala to protect us from the temptations of the dunya that can overshadow our focus in the akhirah. We ask Allah Ta'ala to give us success in this life and the next, and allow our success in this life to be a reason for success in the next life. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. I'm going to open up the Q&A, inshallah. Really quickly, let me just change the, let me just get it loaded, inshallah. So if you go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and the code is, we'll make it 30. Just type in the word 30, THIRTY. So Slido, SLIDO.com, and then you type in the word 30 into the tag. Then you can, you'll be in the question area and you can send some questions. And we'll do some questions tonight for about 10 minutes, inshallah. And then we will we'll wrap up. Sorry, I usually announce it before. I should have announced it at the beginning so people could send. We'll do it now. Okay. Oh, good question. This is really good. Okay. Bismillah. Should we keep and submit receipts for our donations for taxes? Or is this a... does this ruin my sincerity? Very good question. Okay. Should we keep the receipts for our donation for tax credits, or does this ruin sincerity? The answer is absolutely you should seek out whatever material benefit you can from filing your receipts to the government so that you're not taxed on the income that you donated to a nonprofit. Absolutely. That's fully within your right. Okay. It's also not like that money somehow comes back to you. You just don't get taxed on it. So it's ultimately it shouldn't ruin your sincerity because it's not going to really move the needle that much, right? For most people, at least. But absolutely you should. Now, the real question is like, oh, well, should I donate only for the reason of getting tax benefit? And that could be a bigger challenge. I think that ultimately you want to remind yourself that, I'm doing this for the sake of Allah. The other thing is, one way to sort of restore sincerity is to see like I could donate to anything and I'm donating to a Muslim cause. You get the government's less concerned with where you donate. You can donate to, the YMCA, you can donate to PETA, you could donate to anywhere that's a nonprofit, and the government will give you that write-off. They'll give you that receipt, that exemption on your taxes. So why did you choose to donate to a Muslim cause? That, I think, is a proof of sincerity. It's not an allegation. It's a proof. So yes, the summary, when you donate to something that is good, that is Muslim in its nature, you're obviously doing something for the right reason. And then secondarily, taking the penalty of not filing it with your tax return is not righteous, right? You're just giving more money to the government. And actually, you probably don't want to do that, right? Absolutely. So, wallahu a'lam. Are mixed gatherings okay in Islam, men and women? Well, if you're here right now, this is awkward. But so what do we mean by mixed? This is we have to define terms. I think if you're talking about, well, this is a social gathering where there's physical touching and people are, gup-shupping or yapping, as they say, about nothing, then yeah, there's limits. And Islam provides social etiquettes and limits for gathering spaces between the genders, right? But if there is a gathering where the nature and the intention of that gathering is virtuous, and where no one is physically transgressing or trespassing on one another's personal space, and the only people that are sitting, close to each other in very close proximity are people that are related, that are family, and that there are designated sections for men, for women, for families, etc., then there's no problem with that. There's no issue with that, okay? So, this gathering, a gathering where you're learning about Islam, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and people are respecting one another's space, there's no problem with that. But I cannot say the same for a gathering that is, the nature of that gathering is not virtuous, okay, is not seeking the virtue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu a'lam. What's the story behind you coming to be mentored with Sheikh Abdul Nasser? That's a long story. I don't know, man. Allah ta'ala just puts people in your life, and you don't know why. So we'll talk about that probably another time. Why do women have to cover more than men? It's a good question. So in Islam, there's no concept of legal relativity. Okay, we all have, Allah Ta'ala has ordained and His Messenger have ordained certain practices that are universal for everybody. For example, both men and women have to pray. Both men and women have to fast. Both men and women who are, capable and required to have to give zakat, have to perform hajj. All of the base requirements of what it means to be a Muslim are universal. Everybody has to perform them as long as they're able to and they are mature. But then there are gender-specific requirements, and those gender-specific requirements fall towards either gender. So when it comes to certain requirements, maybe when it comes to the financial requirements of maintaining a house and home, that falls on, typically according to the Islamic legal system, on the male, on the man. And there are examples of requirements, one of which is dress, in which the Muslim woman is required to dress differently. It doesn't mean that men don't have to cover, they just cover differently. And there is a different level of covering that women are obligated to do, right? And of course, if you're not doing that yet, then that's a journey that you're on, and may Allah Ta'ala give us all strength to practice this religion as beautifully as we can, inshaAllah. So it's easy when you pick sort of like one of the differences and to say like, well, this is unfair. But when you look at the entirety of the spectrum of legal rulings, what you'll find is that the majority of rulings, overwhelming majority, 95% if not more, are actually shared between men and women. And then what you'll find is that there are different specifics for men and for women that fall in different categories in different places. And so that's the sort of legal philosophy behind that. Wallahu a'lam. What advice do you have for teaching kids to do good even when others aren't watching? If you have any advice, I would love it. You know, what I think is important is you know, when you're a parent, you just have to repeat things a lot. And I think if you repeat things a lot and you try to really leave kids with that understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves them and He's watching them and He knows them, He knows what they're doing. And really try not to make the reward and consequence come solely from the parent. You know, there are times where, you know, you can say that, you know, your kid did something right or wrong, and you can obviously reward them, but I would always attach that back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, when they do something good, you can say, well, I'm able to do this because Allah gave me this, and Allah is rewarding you through me. Allah is using Baba to give you this because you did good. Right, you prayed, and so Allah Ta'ala gave Allah Ta'ala gave Baba the ability to buy you ice cream, because if I didn't have rizq, I couldn't do this, right? And so this is a reward from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. But then also the negative side as well, which is if there's a mistake and maybe they start to get to the age where they're hiding it or they're lying about it or they're concealing it, it's important to sort of not always be dropping the hammer and making them feel like you're constantly going to smash on them, and to say, but just to say, you know, Allah Ta'ala will watch. And also don't have high expectations of kids, man. They're learning. We judge kids before Allah judges them. It's so interesting. You know, like between the ages of, when they're born till they're teenagers, early teens, like Allah is not recording their deeds, you know, until they reach puberty. And then after that, there's a gradual, you have to become more serious, but you can't push them off a cliff, right? Figuratively. And literally, you cannot. So I would say just try to be merciful in your lessons. Try to be merciful in your lessons. Wallahu a'lam. Okay. It is tempting to increase wealth by investing in properties, other investment options that have an element of interest. What is your recommendation with that? Don't do it. No, because look. Anybody who deals with investments will tell you that, subhanAllah, I mean, there were investments that people thought were surefire investments that failed, and there were investments that people thought were horrible investments that blew up and did well. You know, we believe that wealth is more than just math. We believe that there's something called barakah. And in the absence of barakah, that wealth will never, ever succeed. It will never succeed. You know, if a person obtains wealth unlawfully, Allah might actually place a deprivation in that person's life that will drain that wealth from them very quickly. On the contrary, if a person is scrupulous about how they get their wealth, Allah might put ease, or He might extend and stretch the barakah of their wealth so that they're able to afford more with less. So don't get twisted by the numbers, right? There's more than meets the eye. There's always more than meets the eye there. Okay, may Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq. If you do an action to become closer to Allah, like praying on time, is it wrong to feel pleased with that progress? No. You absolutely can feel happy with yourself. You should. It's one of the signs of a good deed. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا صَرَّتْكَ حَسَنَتُكَ وَسَاءَتْكَ سَيِّئَتُكَ فَأَنْتَ مُؤْمِنٌ. If you're happy with your good deeds and you're upset by your bad deeds, you're a believer. So believers should be happy when they do good. They should be upset when they do bad. Okay? But being happy is very different than being arrogant. They're not the same at all. So if a person does good and that good makes them feel good, that's good. But if the good makes them feel like they're better than somebody else, or that they no longer have to care or try, or that they can, then that's not good whatsoever. And that's where a person has to be careful. How do I know if my sins are, wallahu alam, how do I know if my sins are forgiven? If you've repented to Allah, His promise is that He's forgiven you. If you've repented. I know it sounds too easy, but think about how many sins we haven't repented for. Right? So it's actually, the process is simple, but the actual execution is not always easy. Okay? So how do I know if my sins are forgiven? Allah Ta'ala, He said, if you come to me with repentance, I will forgive you. Why are my du'as not being accepted? I've tried everything. If your dua to Allah is, oh Allah, give me what's best. If your heart wants what's best from Allah, then the answer to your dua might be no. Because ultimately you're praying for something, but you just have to accept whatever's best. Right? Like Musa wants a dangerous object. My son who's 7. Baba, can you buy me a sword? And I say no. He says, why? Because you're going to hurt yourself. Baba, do you hate me? No, I don't hate you. In fact, I love you. If I hated you, if I didn't care about you, I would give you the sword. But because I care about you, on the contrary, because I care about you, I'm not doing it. And anybody in this room, if you saw me hand a sharp object to a young kid, you would challenge me and say, what are you thinking? So don't interpret the withholding of something as anger or hatred. That's a very like Calvinist, like prosperity gospel kind of thing. God loves who He gives wealth to. No, that's actually not right. Allah loves those people who He loves. And in fact, in the Islamic tradition, we learn that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a particular love for those people that don't have much. So we should not be affected by the idea that proof of Allah's love is that you have a lot. Okay? So if your du'as are not being accepted, then perhaps the answer to your du'a is actually a no. Now you can keep trying, of course, and you can seek from Allah, but ultimately there's also an element of trust that has to be there as well. Okay, we'll do one more. This is so funny. As a professional Muslim matchmaker, anytime you start that, everyone woke up. Do you lose reward for charging for our services? That's a good question. No, inshallah, if that's not your sole intention, because it's also not your obligation. That's like saying, as a professional Muslim baker, do I lose reward for charging for my, it's not an obligation for you to introduce people for marriage. But of course, your intention can be to provide for your family, but also your higher intention can be to help provide this service for the ummah, so that there is, marriage that people, or there is the institution of marriage for people, inshallah. Okay, I'll do one more. There's a lot. Who are the Sabians? What? What are you? You reading? You're like in the middle of Surah Al-Baqarah today? That's a deep cut. Whoever knows, who are the Sabians? How do you handle non-Muslim friends trying to steer you away from Islam? If Islam means something to you, and you are Muslim, and your friends are trying to turn you away from Islam, it doesn't sound like they're your friends. Friends respect your values. They support you in your decisions. If I tell my friends that I'm a Muslim, and that by being Muslim that means this, and they say, well, that's dumb, that's this and that, then that person just gave me all I need to know about why we shouldn't be friends anymore. And this is where the Prophet ﷺ, his advice about good companionship is so essential. You cannot be a person Mashallah, mashallah. Cutest things I've ever seen in my life. They're matching. That's why you have to be very careful with who you choose to spend time with. It's not wrong to have friends that are non-Muslim, but you need to make sure that any friend you have, by the way, some Muslims steer people away from Islam too. So it's not having a friend, if they're Muslim or non, the qualification of that is that this person should be a positive impact on your Islam. And I've heard stories of non-Muslim college roommates waking up their Muslim roommates for Fajr. I've heard stories of that, you know? So it's not impossible. It's not completely undoable, but you have to make sure that you have standards and that you have right protocol for who you call a friend. Okay? We'll end there, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us and to make our hearts at ease with any of the challenges that we have. And we ask Allah ta'ala to uplift the challenges that are difficult upon us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us sakina and tranquility and to give us certainty in His book and in His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, we'll see everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those of you who are dads who have daughters, there's a daddy-daughter paint night this Friday here with Bloom. Typically, it's for younger daughters, so I don't need like a 30-year-old showing up with her 60-year-old dad. So if you are a father of a younger Muslim girl or even non-Muslim girl, then you can come, inshallah, here for our paint night. Check our Instagram for details, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. So Maghrib is in 4 minutes, inshallah, the adhan. So if you want to head to the musalla,